Graham Mercer slid the divorce papers across the marble table like he was tipping a waitress he didn't respect. He didn't look at Elena when he did it. He looked at the cameras. He looked at his attorney. He looked at the row of family, friends who had packed themselves into the courthouse like it was a performance they'd paid to see. And then, with the particular cruelty of a man who has spent years practicing small humiliations, he leaned toward the microphone and said, clearly, so that everyone in that room and everyone watching on the courthouse steps could hear, Elena leaves with nothing. Came into my life with nothing, and that's exactly how she goes out. The room didn't gasp, it murmured, which was worse. Elena sat very still and signed her name. If you've ever walked out of a room knowing that everyone watching expected you to fall apart and you didn't, then you already understand something about Elena Voss that 3 years of marriage to Graham Mercer never quite managed to destroy. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is the kind that doesn't let you breathe until the very last second. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Elena Voss was 41 years old the morning her marriage ended, and she had not slept in 36 hours. She had spent the previous night sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment. Graham had moved her into 2 years ago, smaller than the house, quieter, easier to explain away, as her preference, going through a folder of documents her attorney had prepared. Not because she expected to find anything new, because she needed something to do with her hands. The folder was thin. That was the point Graham's legal team had been making for 3 months. Elena had signed a prenuptial agreement in the first year of their marriage, during a week when she'd been recovering from a minor surgery, medicated, grateful, and still foolishly in love with a man she believed was in love with her back. The agreement was clean, comprehensive, and, according to Graham's attorney, essentially unbreakable. She kept one photograph on the kitchen table while she read. It was from their first year together, Graham laughing at something off camera, Elena looking at him with an expression she could barely recognize now. She looked like someone who didn't know yet. She put the photograph face down before she went to bed. She didn't throw it away. She wasn't sure why. The courthouse was already crowded when her car pulled up. Graham's family had connections to half the city's social infrastructure aldermen, philanthropists, the kind of people who showed up to divorce proceedings the way they showed up to charity galas, dressed carefully and holding their expressions in place. Elena had known this would happen. She had not known how much it would feel like being tried for a crime she hadn't committed. Her attorney, a compact, serious woman named Diane Cho, leaned close as they walked up the steps. Don't react to anything he says. Not a word, not a look. You react, they frame it. I know, Elena said. I mean it. These people have been rehearsing this. Elena looked at the courthouse doors. So have I. Inside, it was exactly what she'd expected. Graham sat at the opposing table with his attorney and 2 advisors, all of them in dark suits, all of them arranged with the practiced ease of people accustomed to winning rooms. Graham himself looked better than she'd seen him in years, rested, confident, slightly tan. He'd been in Scottsdale the previous week. She'd heard it from a mutual friend who still returned her calls. He didn't look at her either, not at first. The proceeding moved with the grinding, procedural tedium of family court. Documents were entered. Figures were cited. Elena's attorney made her arguments quietly and precisely challenging the enforceability of the prenuptial agreement on the grounds of the circumstances under which it was signed, requesting an equitable review of assets accumulated during the marriage. Graham's attorney responded with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who has already counted the votes. Elena sat straight and kept her face neutral and breathed through her nose the way Diane had coached her. Midway through the morning session, Graham's attorney presented a summary of Elena's contributions to the marriage. The word contributions was used in a tone that implied quotation marks. The summary noted that Elena had left her position at a design consultancy 4 years ago and had not held salaried employment since. It noted that her name appeared on no significant assets. It noted, with a delicacy that was somehow worse than bluntness, that Elena had not produced children, and that the marriage had therefore not resulted in any shared parental obligations that might complicate the division. Elena heard Diane exhale very slowly beside her. "Do you want me to respond to that characterization?" Diane murmured. "Not yet," Elena said. She watched Graham during his attorney's presentation. He was looking at his phone, tilted at an angle that suggested he was reading messages. He looked bored. Not the performed boredom of someone trying to seem above the proceedings, genuine distracted boredom. The way you look when something has already been decided and you're just waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. That was the moment. Elena understood something she hadn't fully allowed herself to understand before. Not that he didn't love her, she'd known that for at least 2 years, but that he had never been particularly nervous about any of this. Not once. Not even in the early months, when she'd threatened to contest the prenuptial agreement and he'd had to spend an entire weekend with his attorney. He'd come home from that meeting and poured himself a drink and watched television, and she had mistaken his calm for confidence in his legal position. Now she understood it was something else. He already knew how it ended. The judge ruled by early afternoon. The prenuptial agreement would stand. The asset review Diane had requested was denied. Elena would receive a settlement covering 3 months of living expenses, a number so specific and so small that it had clearly been calculated with the explicit intention of being just large enough to prevent a sympathetic news story about a woman left with nothing, while being small enough to constitute, in practical terms, nothing. Elena signed. She did not cry. She had made that decision the night before, sitting at the kitchen table not out of pride, not to prove anything to Graham or his family, or the row of watching eyes, but because she was genuinely too tired to perform the grief that would satisfy them. They wanted her to collapse. They'd built this whole day around the expectation of it. She wasn't going to give them that. Graham's attorney closed his folders. Graham finally looked at her. It was a brief look, a second, maybe less, and in it she saw something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not contempt. Something that looked almost like relief, like he'd been carrying something heavy and someone had finally agreed to take it. She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked away first. Outside, the cameras were worse than she'd anticipated. Someone, and she had a strong suspicion it was not Graham's publicist, acting alone, had tipped the entertainment press, and there were now photographers mixed in with the regular courthouse media. A woman's face in the right state of devastation could anchor a gossip column for 3 days. Elena walked out, carrying a single worn leather suitcase, everything of genuine personal value she'd removed from the apartment over the past 6 weeks. A few things at a time, quietly enough that Graham hadn't asked about it. The suitcase was old, bought at a flea market years before she'd met him, and it looked exactly like what it was, something that had survived a lot. She heard Graham behind her on the steps, speaking to someone in the press cluster. His voice carried. It was meant to. Elena and I had fundamental differences that couldn't be reconciled. I wish her the best. She leaves with what the court determined was fair, which, given the circumstances, was exactly what she brought to the marriage. Kept walking. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps down toward the street. She was calculating the number of steps to the corner, where her car was parked, when the sound hit her. It wasn't loud at first, just the low particular rumble of a powerful engine moving at controlled speed. Kind of sound that makes people on sidewalks stop talking and look up. 1 black sedan came around the corner, then another, then 3 more behind it. The convoy moved with an unhurried precision that was, in its own way, more alarming than speed. 7 vehicles in total, all of them identical, long, dark, with tinted windows that gave away nothing. They pulled to the curb in front of the courthouse in a formation that blocked the street completely without appearing to rush to do so. The cameras swung away from Elena. The photographers turned. Crowd on the steps went quiet in the specific way that happens when people register something they don't understand but instinctively recognize as significant. The drivers stepped out, first men in dark suits, moving with the economy of people who have practiced this many times. They positioned themselves without apparent instruction, creating a corridor between the lead vehicle and the base of the courthouse steps. Nobody spoke. Elena had stopped on the 4th step from the bottom. She wasn't sure when she'd stopped. She became aware that she was holding her suitcase very tightly. The rear door of the center vehicle opened. The man who stepped out was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that he carried height the way some people carry authority, like a thing they'd long stopped thinking about. He was in his mid-40s, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples, and he wore a charcoal suit that had not come off a rack. His face was the kind that people noticed, without immediately being able to explain why not handsome in a conventional way, but specific, precise. The face of a man who made very few unnecessary decisions. He walked toward the courthouse steps with the measured calm of someone who had calculated exactly how long this would take and had no interest in rushing it. Stopped at the base of the steps. He looked at Elena, and then in a voice that was not loud but carried perfectly through the dead silence that had fallen over the street, he said, "You're not going anywhere alone. I came to take my wife home." The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Elena did not move. She stood on the 4th step with her old leather suitcase and looked at the man at the bottom of the stairs, a man she had met exactly twice in her life, briefly, at events she barely remembered, and felt the particular sensation of a floor dropping out from under a room she'd thought was solid. She knew who he was. Most people in this city did, if only in the vague, careful way you know things about people whose names you've heard in certain tones of voice. Adrian Vale. The name appeared in newspaper stories that were always written at a slight remove, with qualifications, with sourcing that was never quite on the record. Successful investor, founder of a private security and logistics firm, believed to have significant interests in, and here the articles would always get vague, various sectors of the city's economic infrastructure. The city's criminal infrastructure was what people meant when they said that. She had met him twice. Once at a charity event she'd attended with Graham 3 years ago, where Adrian had shaken her hand and said something polite about the cause and moved on. Once at a business dinner she hadn't been supposed to attend, where she'd been seated next to him for 20 minutes before Graham noticed and moved her to another table. She had found him striking both times. She had not spent time thinking about it, and now he was standing at the bottom of a courthouse in front of cameras and photographers, and Graham Mercer's assembled social circle claiming to be her husband. She heard Graham's voice from behind her. He'd pushed forward through the press cluster. His voice had changed, still controlled, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Something tighter. What the hell is this? Adrian didn't look at Graham. He looked at Elena. "You should come down from those steps," he said. "Cold. I'm not your wife," Elena said. She said it quietly, because she didn't trust what her voice would do at higher volume, and she said it very clearly, because she needed to understand his face when she said it. Face did not change. "I know you have questions," he said. "I'll answer them. But not here. Then where?" "Somewhere that isn't a press event." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at the street, at the 7 black cars, the men in suits, the complete, controlled stillness of it all, and then she looked back at the courthouse steps, where Graham had positioned himself with his attorney at his elbow, and his face doing something complicated. "If I get in that car," she said, "and you don't explain every single word of what you just said." "You can leave," Adrian said. "Anytime. My people don't lock doors." She didn't believe that entirely, but she believed it enough. She walked down the remaining 4 steps and stopped in front of him. Up close, he was more tired than he'd looked from the steps. Not weak tired, more the kind of tired that accumulates in people who carry things for a long time without setting them down. 1 hour, she said. "That's fine." She walked past him toward the lead car. One of the suited men opened the rear door without being asked. She didn't look back at the courthouse. She didn't look back at Graham. She got in. The door closed. Inside, the car smelled like leather and something faintly cedar adjacent, and it was very quiet. The street noise dropped away entirely. She could hear her own breathing. Adrian got in beside her a moment later. He didn't sit close. He positioned himself near the opposite window and looked straight ahead, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Convoy moved. "Start talking," Elena said. "I will, but I want you to know first. I didn't plan today the way you're going to think I planned it." "What way is that?" "Like a performance. Like something arranged for an audience." She looked out the window. The courthouse was already behind them. "Then what was it?" a message. To Graham. To his family. There's a difference. She thought about the look on Graham's face when the convoy had appeared. Tightened jaw, the something underneath it. It had not looked like the face of a man who was simply confused. It had looked like the face of a man receiving information he'd been hoping not to receive. You said I was your wife, she said. Yes, I'm not. Legally, Adrian said carefully, the situation is more complicated than that. She turned to look at him. Explain complicated. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a folded document. He held it out to her without ceremony. She took it. It was several pages, dense with legal language. The header read, Vale Winslow Family Trust Beneficiary Documentation and Protective Covenant. She had never heard of the Vale Winslow Family Trust. She started reading. The car moved through the city, and the afternoon light shifted, and Elena read 4 pages of legal language that progressively rearranged everything she thought she understood about the past 3 years. The trust had been established decades earlier. It named as its primary beneficiary a woman born to a man named Thomas Winslow, a name Elena had not heard since she was 19 years old. Since a funeral she'd attended in a small town 200 miles from here, standing next to a grave she'd been told was her father's. Thomas Winslow, her father. The trust named his surviving heir as the sole beneficiary of assets that, in the document's clinical language, were described as substantial holdings in financial instruments, real property, and commercial interests. And then on page 3, a clause that her eyes moved over twice before the meaning assembled itself. In the event that the named beneficiary entered into a marriage or legal partnership, protective custodianship of the trust assets would transfer to a designated protector, a role filled by the head of the Vale family, under an agreement executed between Thomas Winslow and the Vale family 13 years ago. Elena lowered the document. My father is dead, she said. I know you believe that. The car turned. I know you believe that, Adrian said again quietly, because you were told he died. But I need you to understand something before we go any further, and I need you to hear it before you make a decision about whether to trust anything I say. She waited. Your father has been alive for 11 years, Adrian said, and the people who told you he died were the same people who spent the next 8 years arranging your marriage to Graham Mercer. The city moved past the windows. Elena held the document in her hands and said nothing, because there was nothing available to say. Every sentence she reached for dissolved before she could finish it. The sounds of the car and the street in the afternoon filled the space where her thoughts should have been. Then, very slowly, something cold and clarifying moved through her. Not panic. Something colder than panic, and in some ways more useful. She thought about the prenuptial agreement she'd signed while she was recovering from surgery. She thought about the timing of it, how Graham had presented it as a formality. Something his family's attorney required, nothing to worry about. She thought about the look on his face when finally signed, thin but not relieved. Already decided. She thought about the charity event 3 years ago, where she'd met Adrian Vale for the first time. How Graham had appeared at her elbow within minutes and steered her toward another group of people. She'd thought at the time it was possessiveness, maybe jealousy. She thought about the business dinner, the 20 minutes she'd sat next to Adrian. The way Graham had noticed and moved her to another table without explanation. She'd been embarrassed, quietly furious. Graham had said later that he didn't want her getting caught up in conversations with certain kinds of people. She'd assumed he meant because of reputation, social caution, kind of careful distance wealthy families maintained from anything that might create unwanted associations. Now she looked at the document in her hands and thought, he knew. He knew who Adrian was in relation to this trust. He knew that proximity between them was dangerous to Graham's plan, whatever his plan was. The trust, she said. Graham knew about it. Adrian looked at her. The divorce, she said. It wasn't just a marriage ending, was it? No. The divorce was supposed to isolate me, legally, financially, cut me off from any protections so that, she stopped, so that whoever controls the trust has an uncontested path to its assets, Adrian finished. With you legally isolated, financially dependent, and without knowledge of the trust's existence, any documents placed in front of you would be signed out of desperation rather than understanding. pressed her thumb against the corner of the document, hard enough to feel the paper edge. How long have you known? About the trust? 13 years my family has been party to it. About your father being alive? He paused. 8 years. 8 years, she repeated. Yes. And you didn't, she stopped herself. Started again. Why didn't you? Because exposing your father too early would have scattered his organization and lost everything. 8 years of investigation would have collapsed. He met her eyes. I know that's not what you want to hear. It wasn't. It landed somewhere between her ribs and stayed there. I wasn't a piece on your board, she said. Whatever your reasons. I know. I'm not interested in one man's protection over another man's. I spent 3 years in that position, and I have nothing to show for it except a prenup and a suitcase. I know that too. Then why am I in this car? He was quiet for a moment. The convoy had slowed. They were passing through a quieter part of the city. Now older buildings, less traffic. Because you have a right to know the truth, he said. And because the people who've been managing this situation for the last 11 years are still moving. The divorce was supposed to end today with you, in a specific position. Didn't end that way. Which means someone has to recalculate, and I don't know yet what that recalculation looks like. You're saying I'm still in danger. I'm saying the game didn't stop, because the courthouse did. She looked at him for a long moment. His face gave away very little, but his hands she noticed. His hands were still. Deliberately, consciously still. In the way of someone who'd learned to control their tells. I'm not coming to stay with you, she said. I'm not your wife. I'm not under your protection. And I'm not exchanging one arrangement for another. All right. But I want to see everything. Every document connected to this trust. Every record you have on my father. Everything. That's reasonable. And if at any point I decide I want to leave, the door is open, he said. I meant that. She looked out the window. The afternoon was tipping toward early evening. The light doing that particular autumn thing where it went golden and citron sideways. The kind of light that made ordinary streets look like they were remembering something. She thought about the courthouse, the cameras, the carefully arranged audience. Graham's voice saying she'd come with nothing and left with nothing. She thought about the photograph she'd turned face down on the kitchen table. I want to see the records tonight, she said. They'll be ready. Car moved. Somewhere in the city, in a room she'd never been in, next to a man who had been watching her life from the outside for years. The story of the past 3 years was about to be translated into a language she hadn't had access to. She gripped the document in her lap and said nothing else. The drive took 20 minutes. The estate was at the north edge of the city, not ostentatious from the outside. A fact that she registered with the particular attention of someone who'd spent years in a world where money announced itself loudly. The gates were heavy iron, the grounds well maintained but not theatrical. Inside, the house was large, quiet, warm in the lighting, books on real shelves, a fireplace with ash in it, recently used. She was brought to a study on the second floor where a long table had been set with files. Real files printed, indexed, labeled. Not a presentation, a record. She sat down. An older man she hadn't been introduced to brought her coffee without asking whether she wanted it. She found she did. She opened the first file. The photograph on the top page was of a man she hadn't seen in over 2 decades. Older now, heavier, with a beard she didn't recognize, and eyes she did. He was photographed from a distance, entering a building she didn't recognize in a city she couldn't immediately place. Her father's face, her father's eyes. Her hand shook for exactly 4 seconds. Then it stopped. She turned the page and began to read. Adrian stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at her bent over the files with her jaw set and her coffee going cold at her elbow, and he looked away. Outside the study window, his head of security was waiting in the corridor with an expression that needed no words. Something moved, the man said quietly. About an hour ago. We're not sure what yet. Adrian kept his voice low. How serious? Serious enough that you should know. He looked back through the doorway at Elena, at the woman who had walked out of a courthouse with a single suitcase and walked into a story she hadn't known she was living inside. Keep watching, he said, and make sure the south gate is covered. He did not tell her. Not yet. She was reading about her father, and she needed to finish what she was reading. But his hands, when he turned away from the door, were no longer quite so still. She was on the 4th file when she found the wire transfers. They weren't hidden, or rather, they had been hidden, carefully, inside the kind of corporate layering that required a forensic accountant and several years of patience to unravel. But Adrian's people had done the unraveling, and what was left was a table of transactions, dates, account numbers, and at the end of each row, a name or a code that corresponded to a legend at the bottom of the page. Elena's eyes moved down the column of names. The third one from the bottom was Graham Mercer. She didn't make a sound. She just sat very still and looked at the number next to his name, a transfer of $460,000, executed 11 months before their wedding, and felt something in her chest go very quiet. The way a room goes quiet when the power cuts out and you realize how much noise you'd stopped hearing. She turned the page. There were 9 more transfers, different amounts, spread across 3 years. The last one was dated 4 months ago, at a time when Graham had told her he was attending a conference in Portland. She closed the file. She sat with her hands flat on the cover and breathed through her nose. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, and waited for the emotion to arrive and settle into something she could work with. It arrived. It settled. Then she stood up and walked to the doorway. Adrian was in the corridor 20 feet away, speaking in a low voice to the man she'd seen earlier. He noticed her immediately. She registered that about him. The way his attention moved, quick and complete, the moment something in his environment changed. "The wire transfers," she said, "to Graham." The other man glanced at Adrian and took a step back. "You've seen those," Adrian said. It wasn't a question. 11 months before we got married, she said. $460,000. Yes. Was that the first payment? Adrian looked at her steadily. To Graham directly, yes. There were earlier payments to a holding company his father controls, going back about 6 years before you met him. She leaned against the doorframe because her legs wanted to do something. Her brain was refusing to authorize. So his family was being paid for the whole marriage, for arranging it and maintaining it. Maintaining it, she repeated. The phrase had a particular quality, functional, administrative, the language of logistics. I was a what? A position to be maintained. You were the key to the trust, Adrian said. Your father needed you legally positioned, married, without prenuptial challenges, without independent assets. The marriage to Graham created a structure where your father's people believed they could eventually maneuver the trust transfer. My father paid Graham's family to marry me to him. Yes, she laughed. It came out short, not particularly amused, and she didn't try to stop it. Stopped. Started again, and Graham. Did he know what I was to begin with? Before they introduced us? Adrian was quiet for half a second too long. Tell me, she said. The introduction was engineered. Yes. He knew who you were before he met you. She thought about the gallery opening where they'd met, how Graham had appeared at her shoulder at the exact moment she was standing alone in front of a painting she didn't, especially like a glass of wine in her hand, feeling slightly out of place. How he'd made a joke about the painting that was just perceptive enough to seem genuine. How she'd laughed. She thought about how she'd told that story for 3 years as the story of how they met. She'd told it at dinner parties. She'd told it to her friend Carla over the phone. She'd told it to herself on the nights when the marriage felt like something she was failing at, as a reminder that it started somewhere real. It had not started anywhere real. Okay, she said. Adrian watched her. Okay, she said again. What else? Straightened. You should sleep. It's almost... What else is in those files? Pause this time was different, not hesitation, but something more like assessment. The kind of look that weighs not whether to tell you something, but whether you are in a condition to receive it. There's more on your father's current operations, he said, and there's a separate file I'd suggest you wait on. Which file? The one on your mother. She went very still. My mother died when I was 7, she said. I know that's what you were told. Corridor was quiet. Somewhere below them, the house made the sounds old houses make a pipe. A settling joint, the particular creak of a building at rest. You're telling me my mother is also... I don't know, Adrian said. That file is incomplete. I don't want you to read an incomplete file at midnight and spend the next 6 hours building a story around gaps. She looked at him. He looked back. His face was doing the thing again. Controlled, careful, giving away nothing except. She was starting to notice the very slight tension around his eyes when he was telling the truth about something difficult. She'd seen that tension twice now. Both times, he'd been telling her something she didn't want to hear. Fine, she said. Tomorrow. She went back to the table, picked up the next file and opened it. Adrian stayed in the corridor for a moment. Then he said quietly, "There's a room prepared on the second floor. When you're done." She didn't answer. She was already reading. She made it through 2 more files before her vision started blurring at the edges, not from emotion, just from 38 hours, without real sleep catching up to her all at once. She marked her place. With a strip of paper she found in the file, straightened the stack, and went to find the room. Plain and clean. A bed, a lamp, a window that looked out onto the north grounds. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her shoes and looked at the wall and thought, in the particular floating way of someone too tired for fully formed thoughts, about the gallery opening, about Graham's joke about the painting, about how she'd laughed. She was asleep before she finished the thought. She woke at 5:47 to the sound of raised voices below. Not shouting, the walls were thick, and whatever soundproofing existed in the house was doing its job. But voices at a volume and register that didn't match a normal hour, carrying up through the floor in a way that tugged her out of sleep before she understood why. She sat up, listened. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone, sharp, clipped, the particular rhythm of people moving fast and talking over each other. Someone was on a phone. Someone else was giving instructions in a low, rapid voice that traveled differently. She got up, found her shoes, and went to the door. Corridor was lit. 2 men she hadn't seen before were moving toward the staircase at the far end, not running, but close to it. A third man appeared from a room across the corridor and said something into a radio in a voice too low to catch. She went after the first 2 men. At the top of the stairs, she found Adrian. He was standing at a table in the hallway. She hadn't noticed the table the night before, but now it had a laptop open on it and a tactical map of something printed and spread out and held flat by 2 coffee cups. He was on the phone. He glanced at her, held up one finger, and kept talking. "How many points?" he said into the phone. "Yes." "What's the perimeter at the east side?" A pause. "Then close it. Don't wait for confirmation. Just close it." He ended the call and looked at her. He looked, she thought, exactly like someone who had not slept at all. "What happened?" she said. "We had a breach in the security perimeter." Not the house, the outer perimeter. Motion on the east line at around 3 a.m. that the system flagged, and we're still analyzing. You're saying someone was watching the property. I'm saying something moved on the east line at 3 a.m., and we don't know yet whether it was a person, an animal, or a sensor malfunction. He picked up one of the coffee cups, then put it down without drinking from it. What I'm taking it seriously for is because of something else that happened at the same time. He turned the laptop toward her. It was an email chain. She could see that much at a glance. A printout of multiple messages. The top one, time-stamped 3:17 a.m. She leaned in and read. The email at the top was addressed to an account she didn't recognize, sent from another account she didn't recognize, and it contained 4 words and a set of GPS coordinates. The 4 words were, "She is there now." The coordinates, she realized after a moment, were the coordinates of this estate. She straightened up slowly. "Someone in your organization," she said. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Not much enough. It appears that way. Someone told my father's people where I am." "Yes." She looked at the map on the table. The estate's perimeter was marked in red. 3 points were circled, one of them on the east side. "How many people knew I was coming here last night?" 8 people in this building and 3 outside it. "Then you have a leak." "Yes," he said. He said it flatly, without apparent surprise, which told her he'd already been sitting with this for a while. "Do you know which one?" He looked at her. "I have a suspicion. I'd rather be certain." "How long to be certain?" "A few hours. Maybe less." He picked up the coffee cup again, and this time drank from it. "I want you to stay in the main building today. Not as a restriction, as a precaution. I understand the difference." "Good." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. The circled east point. At the coordinates on the email that someone had sent at 3:17 a.m. to tell her father's people exactly where she was sleeping. "Are you going to tell me who you suspect?" she asked. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because if I'm wrong, I'll have damaged something I can't repair. And if I'm right," he set the cup down. If I'm right, I need the next few hours to go a specific way. She didn't like it. She let him see that she didn't like it. But she also understood, in a practical way, the logic. Fine, she said. Is there more coffee? There was more coffee. She took a mug and went back to the study and opened the file she'd marked with the strip of paper and kept reading. 3 hours later, the window beside her exploded inward. It happened in the compressed, stuttering way that violent things happen when you're not expecting them. One moment she was reading. The next, the glass was across the room in a shower of fragments, and the sound of the shot arrived half a second after the damage, and Elena was on the floor without having consciously decided to get there. Her mug had shattered. Coffee was spreading across the floorboards. From somewhere below and to the right, outside, another shot. Then a third. Then the particular, terrible sound of return fire, shorter, more controlled from somewhere closer, inside the grounds. She stayed low. She pressed her back against the solid wall below the window and felt her heart doing something violent and fast in her chest, and thought, with the rigid clarity that occasionally arrives in bad moments, that she needed to move toward the door and not stay in a room with a broken window. She moved. She was halfway across the room when Adrian came through the door, crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and had her arm not rough, but definitive, and they were moving into the corridor before she'd fully processed his arrival. Are you hit? He said. No, you're sure. I'm sure. They were moving fast down the corridor. 2 of his men materialized from a side door and fell in, one ahead and one behind. The east perimeter, she said. They came through the east line. 3 shooters that we've confirmed. Possibly more. He steered her into a turn, down a secondary staircase she hadn't known existed. The main team has them contained. He paused just briefly. This is moving faster than I expected. Your suspicion, she said. The leak. Did they know about this too? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. They came out through a basement-level door into a covered garage. 4 vehicles, his men were already positioned, engines running on 2 of the cars. I'm not leaving without the files, she said. They've been copied. Copies are already, the originals. I'm not leaving the originals in a building that people are currently shooting at. He looked at her. Something in his face moved not quite approval. Something more complicated and less comfortable than approval. Kowalski, he said to one of his men, the study. Files on the table. All of them. 2 minutes. The man went. Elena stood in the garage and listened to the sound of gunfire, above and outside, and felt, under the fear, which was real, and she wasn't pretending it wasn't, a cold, clarifying fury taking shape. Someone had been watching. Someone had sent coordinates. Someone in this building. Someone Adrian trusted had given away her location to the people who wanted to use her as a mechanism for stealing an inheritance she hadn't known existed. Her father's people. Her father. She thought about the photograph in the file. The older face, the unfamiliar beard, the eyes she recognized. Kowalski reappeared with the files in a case. 2 minutes, exactly. They got into the car. As the convoy pulsed out through the garage exit onto a service road, Elena looked out the rear window at the house, receding behind them. On the east side, she could see movement figures, vehicles, the strobing of flashlights in the early morning gray. Adrian's people were pushing back. She turned forward. The traitor, she said. The person in your organization who sent the email. I have a name, Adrian said. He was looking at his phone, his face very still. Confirmed 6 minutes ago. Who? He told her. It was a man named Rourke. She hadn't met him, but she'd seen him the night before. One of the men who'd been in the corridor when the voices had woken her. Middle-aged, gray-haired, quiet. He'd been with Adrian's organization for 11 years. How long has he been feeding information, she said. We don't know yet. Long enough to know about you. Long enough to have the perimeter map. Where is he now? In custody. In the East Outbuilding, which is, ironically, about 400 meters from where the shooters came through. She sat with that. He knew they were coming. He may have facilitated the timing. Convoy moved onto the main road. The estate was behind them. The city was ahead, its morning traffic just beginning to gather, ordinary and indifferent. Where are we going? Elena said. Secondary location. Safe. You said that about the estate. I said the people who shot at your window were moving faster than I expected, Adrian said. The secondary location hasn't been compromised. Different 3 people know it. She turned to look at him. Different 3 people that you trust. Different 3 people that I trust so far, he said. And there was something in the way he said it so far that was more honest than reassurance. And she found, to her own slight surprise, that she trusted him more for it. They rode in silence for a while. Then the phone in Adrian's hand buzzed, and he looked at it, and something in his face changed. She watched him read whatever was on the screen. She watched his jaw tighten and then relax again with the careful deliberateness of someone actively controlling a reflex. She watched him put the phone face down on his knee. "What?" she said. He looked at the road ahead. "Graham is at the estate." She blinked. "What do you mean Graham is at the—" "He arrived 20 minutes ago. On foot, apparently, through the main gate. Told my people he was alone and that he needed to talk to you." Adrian's voice was completely flat. "He says that his family has threatened to have him killed if he doesn't deliver something to them by this afternoon." Elena looked at the back of the driver's seat. Graham, on foot, at an estate that had just been shot at, coming to find her. "Is he telling the truth?" she said. "He looked it," Adrian said. "Doesn't mean he is." "You've seen the footage." "I've seen the footage." She looked out the window. The city was morning gray and moving and completely unaware. A woman with a stroller, a man with a coffee, pigeons on a ledge, doing what pigeons do. "He knew about the trust," she said. "He knew from the beginning." "Yes. He recorded my conversations." "You said he delivered recordings to my father's people." "Yes." "So whatever fear he's feeling now," she said, "is the fear of someone who built the trap and is now caught in it." Adrian was quiet. "Bring him," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever he knows," she said, "I want to hear it from him." To his face, she turned back to the window. "And I want you in the room when he says it." The convoy moved through the gray morning, carrying Elena Voss toward the version of her life she hadn't been allowed to know existed. And somewhere behind them, Graham Mercer sat in a room that smelled like someone else's cigarettes and waited to find out if the woman he had helped betray was going to be his way out or his final mistake. The secondary location was a converted warehouse on the industrial west side of the city. 3 floors, brick exterior, the kind of building that looked abandoned from the street and was not abandoned at all. Elena had stopped registering details by the time they arrived, not because she wasn't paying attention, but because her attention had narrowed to a single point, the way attention does when a body has been running on adrenaline and bad coffee for too long, and finally it decides to triage. Graham was coming, that was the point. They put her in a room on the 2nd floor, a real room, not a holding space, with a table and chairs and a window that looked out onto a blank brick wall across an alley. Someone brought water. Someone else brought food she didn't touch. She sat at the table with the copied files and waited, and the waiting was its own kind of violence. He arrived 40 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps, 2 sets of heavier feet, flanking 1 set of lighter ones. The particular cadence of a man being escorted rather than walking freely. Then the door opened, and Graham Mercer walked into the room, and Elena looked at him across the table. He looked terrible. That was the first thing, and she registered it with a clinical detachment that surprised her. His suit was the same one he'd worn to the courthouse, wrinkled now, 1 cuff slightly torn at the button. He had not shaved since yesterday. His face had the particular grayish, hollowed quality of someone who had spent the night being afraid. And Graham had never been good at fear. He'd always been better at performing emotions than feeling them. But there was nothing performed about what was on his face right now. 2 of Adrian's men positioned themselves at the door and stayed. Adrian himself stood near the window, slightly behind Elena's sightline, not speaking. Graham's eyes moved from Elena to Adrian and back to Elena. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. He closed his mouth. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She looked at him for a moment. At the man she'd spent 3 years trying to reach, trying to understand, trying to find somewhere inside the marriage that felt like solid ground. The man whose joke about a painting she'd carried for years as the story of how they began. "You knew who I was before we met," she said. "Start there." Graham's hands were on the table. He looked at them. "Elena, start there, Graham." He exhaled. It was a shaky exhale, not controlled, not performed. "Yes." "I knew." "What did you know specifically?" "That you were Thomas Winslow's daughter." that there was a trust, that my father had been in contact with people connected to Winslow for. He stopped. For a long time before I met you. How long? Since I was in my 20s. Maybe before. He looked up. I didn't know the full picture then. I was told there was an arrangement, that I would meet a woman, the marriage needed to happen, and that my family would fit significantly if it did. And you agreed. Something moved across his face. Not shame, exactly, something thinner than shame, more like the residue of it. I was 29. My father had just restructured our family's assets in a way that left me with essentially nothing without his approval. He made it very clear that cooperation had value. You were paid to marry me, Elena said. It wasn't. He stopped himself. Try it again. It was framed as a business arrangement that would benefit everyone. Including me? He didn't answer. Including me, Graham. No, he said quietly. Not including you. The room was very still. Elena picked up the page from the file, the transfer summary. 9 rows, 9 amounts. The last one 4 months ago. She slid it across the table toward him. He looked at it. Jaw moved. 9 payments, she said. Over 4 years. What were you delivering? He said nothing. The recordings, she said. Adrian told me. You recorded my conversations. What conversations specifically? Graham looked at Adrian. Adrian didn't move, didn't speak. Didn't offer anything. My phone calls, Graham said. Emails. One meeting you had with a financial advisor the year before last. Anything that indicated whether you'd found out about the trust, whether you were taking steps. Taking steps, she repeated. Protect myself. Yes. So every time I came close to asking questions, to looking into my finances, to talking to someone, they knew. His voice was low and flat, within about 24 hours. Yes. She thought about the financial advisor. A woman named Parson, referred by a friend, whom Elena had met at a coffee shop to discuss the possibility of setting up an independent account. She'd mentioned it to Graham the night before, as though it were nothing, just something she was curious about. The appointment had been moved 3 times, and then canceled when Parson's office called to say she'd had a family emergency. Elena had rescheduled twice and eventually let it drop. Parson, she said. Graham's expression answered before he did. You had the appointment canceled. My father did, because you told them I was going. He said nothing. His hands pressed flat against the table. I want to ask you something, Elena said, and I want you to think about it before you answer, because I'm not going to ask it twice. She waited until he looked at her. Was there any part of it that was real? Any part? One moment, one conversation, one anything. Or was it management? Start to finish. Graham held her gaze for longer than she expected. The first year, he said. Parts of the first year. Before they needed you to start reporting. Before it felt like reporting, yes. He paused. I know it's not what I was hoping for, she said. But it's honest. Which is more than most of the last 3 years. She pulled the page back and squared it with the file. Then Adrian spoke from the window, and his voice was quiet and entirely without gentleness. Tell her why you came here, Graham. Graham looked at him. Not the version about your family threatening you, Adrian said. The other reason. Something shifted in Graham's face, a crack in the performance he'd been constructing since he walked in. Not the performance of fear, which was real. The performance of a man who had come here with one primary purpose, and was being required to surface it before he was ready. My father called me at 4 a.m., Graham said. He told me the operation at the estate hadn't gone the way Winslow expected, that Elena was still unaccounted for. He said the phrase carefully, like it had been given to him in those exact words, and he was not ready to translate it into his own. He said Winslow was moving to the contingency. Elena looked at him. What contingency? There's a document, Graham said. A secondary instrument. Not the trust itself, a power of attorney. Broad. Comprehensive. If it's signed, it gives full control of the trust to a designated representative without Elena having to be present for any subsequent transfers. Adrian moved from the window. 1 step, 2 steps, until he was beside the table. Where is this document? I don't know where it is right now, but I know what activates it. What activates it? Graham looked at Elena. Proof that you're incapacitated, medically, legally, either declared incompetent or confirmed deceased. The word landed in the room and sat there. Elena heard it. She let it land fully. She didn't look away from Graham's face. Winslow's contingency, she said. If he can't get me to sign voluntarily, he makes me unavailable. Yes, he kills me. Graham's throat moved. Or has you declared legally incompetent? There are physicians in his network, judges. But killing me is faster. Yes, Graham said, very quietly. Killing you is faster. She looked at her hands on the table. They were steady. She found that interesting. And you came here to tell me this, she said. Yes. Why? The question sat between them. Graham looked like a man trying to locate something he'd misplaced a long time ago and wasn't certain still existed. "'Cause I watched them vote to have you killed," he said, "in my father's dining room. At the table where I grew up eating breakfast. They discussed it the way you'd discuss a contractor." Quote. He stopped. His hands pressed harder against the table. I spent 3 years telling myself there was a version of this that didn't end with you actually getting hurt, that it was money, that it was business, that you'd walk away with the settlement and it would be over and no one would actually. He stopped again. It was wrong. Elena looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the things she could say to that, all the devastations available, all the precise and accurate things she could put in a row and watch land on him one at a time. She had them. She'd been building them for the last 18 hours without quite knowing she was doing it. She chose one. You're telling me you have a conscience, Graham. That's not the same as having done the right thing. He looked at the table. But you're here, she said. So, what do you actually know that helps? He reached inside his jacket. One of the men at the door stepped forward, and Graham froze immediately, both hands visible. Adrian said, "Let him." Graham reached in more slowly and produced a phone. He set it on the table and slid it toward Elena. My father's private calendar. I forwarded myself a copy 2 days ago when I understood what the meeting was about. He gestured at the phone. There's a meeting scheduled tomorrow night. My father and Winslow's representative. Not Winslow himself, he doesn't meet directly, but whoever controls the logistics. Elena looked at the phone but didn't touch it yet. We're a warehouse, Riverside. Winslow uses it for storage. It's listed as a refrigeration and distribution company. Elena looked at Adrian. Adrian was looking at the phone. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before, gone very focused and very still in a way that was different from his usual control. This was the stillness of recognition. Riverside Cold Storage, he said. It wasn't a question. Graham looked at him. You know it. I've been trying to identify Winslow's primary logistics hub for 4 years. He looked at Elena. The meeting is there. Then my father will be there, she said. Or close enough, his representative. No. She felt something cold and certain settling into place. If Graham's right about the contingency, Winslow can't afford to have this meeting go wrong. He'll be there. He'll want to oversee the close of it himself. She looked at Graham. What time? 9 p.m. tomorrow. She picked up the phone, looked at the calendar entry. A block of time 7 p.m. to open-ended. A location listed as a business name she didn't recognize, and a note in her father's representative's shorthand that she couldn't decode. She set the phone down. We have about 36 hours, she said. Adrian was already pulling out his own phone. I need to make calls. Wait, she said. He stopped. She looked at Graham. Power of attorney document. You said you don't know where it is. You know who has it. Graham hesitated 1 beat too long. Graham. My father's attorney holds it, he said. A man named Carr. He has offices downtown. Is it executed yet? Have any of the physician signatures been obtained? He stopped. I don't think so. As of 2 days ago, it hadn't been. They needed proof of incapacity first. So the document exists, but it's not yet actionable. Correct. She nodded once. Adrian. How quickly can you get to Carr's office? Adrian looked at her with an expression that was beginning to feel familiar, the one where he was recalibrating something based on her. Legally? He said. However, she said. I don't care about however. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, not warm exactly, more like the involuntary response of someone encountering something unexpected. Then he made 2 calls in rapid succession, turned away from the table, and spoke in a low voice she wasn't meant to hear. She turned back to Graham. You're going to stay here, she said. He nodded. Not because I trust you, she said. Because if you go back to your father, you'll have to tell him you found me. And then this is over before it starts. I know. And because, she said, and she let herself look at him with the full weight of the last 3 years. If something goes wrong tomorrow night, I want you to have to sit somewhere and know that you're the reason it went wrong. He received that. He didn't flinch from it. Maybe that was the most honest thing she'd seen from him. Adrian finished his calls. He turned back to the room. Carr's office, he said to Elena. 3 hours. My people are moving now. The document needs to be secured, not destroyed, she said. If Winslow's people realize it's gone copied and replaced, he won't know. And we need something else. She pulled a blank page from the file folder and looked at it for a moment. We need a record of the incapacity evidence they've already gathered, whatever physicians they've contacted. If we don't know what they have, we can't know what the document currently supports. Adrian looked at her steadily. Where do you suggest we get that? She looked at Graham. Graham understood. My father's study. Keeps physical files. He doesn't a slight wince. He doesn't trust digital for certain things. Can you get into your father's study without triggering alarm? I have a code. I don't know if he's changed it since this morning. When did you last use it? 3 days ago. Then it's probably current. She stood up. We need both things tonight, Adrian said Elena. She looked at him. You understand that if we move on Carr's office and your father's house in the same night, and anything goes wrong at either location, they'll know we know, she said. Yes. The meeting tomorrow night gets canceled. Winslow goes to ground. We lose the window. Then nothing goes wrong, she said. It was the wrong kind of certainty. For the situation, she knew that. It was the certainty of someone who had run out of the luxury of doubt, which is a different thing from confidence and sometimes more dangerous. But the alternative was waiting, and waiting meant 36 hours in a room while her father moved pieces she couldn't see. She wasn't waiting. Adrian held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned to his man at the door. Get Harmon and Chen, and tell them to bring the van, not the cars. The man left. Elena looked at Graham one more time. He was sitting at the table with his hands still pressed flat, and his face doing something quiet and ruined, the face of a man tabulating a debt he already knows he can't pay. Get some sleep, she told him. He looked up. You're going to need to be coherent tomorrow night, she said. When we get to the warehouse, you're coming. His face went still. What? You said your father and Winslow's people trust you enough to include you in meetings, that you've been in that room. She picked up the file. You're going to be in that room again. Elena, if Winslow... I'm not asking, she said. You made choices. This is what they cost. She walked past him to the door, and Adrian fell into step beside her, and the door closed behind them on Graham Mercer, sitting alone at a table with the weight of the last 3 years rearranging itself into something he was only beginning to understand the shape of. In the corridor, Adrian walked beside her without speaking for a moment. Then he said very quietly, the car operation is straightforward. Your father's house is not. I know. If Graham's code doesn't work, then we adjust. It was quiet again. They were walking toward the staircase, their footsteps even on the concrete floor. You changed in there, he said. She glanced at him. In the room with Graham, he said, you walked in as someone who needed answers. You walked out as someone running an operation. She thought about that. Is that a problem? No, he said. And then after a beat, it changes what tonight looks like. How? Because an hour ago I was planning a defensive play, he said. Now I'm planning something else. She stopped at the top of the stairs, turned to look at him. What changed your mind, she said. He met her eyes. You told a man who helped ruin your life to get some sleep because you need him functional for the next step. He held her gaze. That's not someone who needs protecting. That's someone who needs a competent partner. She looked at him for a moment. The corridor was quiet, the building around them holding its sounds. Somewhere below a door, a voice, the ordinary machinery of people preparing for something. Don't make me regret relying on you, she said. I'll do my best, he said. And the thing about the way he said it, no promise, no reassurance, just the acknowledgement of effort was exactly the right thing. They went down the stairs. Outside, the city was moving into its afternoon hours, gray and ordinary, and completely unaware that somewhere in its West Side industrial district, a woman who had been filed away as a loose end was spending the remaining daylight hours converting herself into the most dangerous thing her father had never anticipated. She was not a victim running out of time. She was the person who had read every file, memorized every transfer, looked her own betrayal in the face across a table, and chosen clearly, consciously, without drama, to use it. The van was waiting in the loading bay. She got in. The operation at Carr's office took 94 minutes and went exactly as planned, which Adrian later said, FM, should have made him more nervous than it did. His people were in and out before 10 p.m. The power of attorney document was photographed, copied with forensic precision, replaced in the exact position it had occupied in Carr's filing system, and the office left without a single sign of entry. Copy came back to the warehouse in a sealed envelope that Elena opened at the table with her second cup of coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice. The document was comprehensive. It was also, she noted with a cold, that had nothing to do with temperature, already partially executed. 2 signatures were present. At the bottom, 2 physicians, both names unfamiliar to her, both with credentials that looked legitimate at first pass and would require verification. The document needed one more signature and a judicial stamp to become actionable, closer than Graham had believed. He lied, she said, not with heat, just as a fact. Adrian looked up from his own table across the room. Graham. He said it hadn't been executed as of 2 days ago. She held up the document. 2 signatures are already here. This was moving, while Graham was still pretending the timetable was theoretical. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Either he didn't know, or he knew, and he's managing what he tells us. She set the document down. Either way, we don't assume anything he says is complete. Agreed. She looked at the 2 physician signatures. 2 men whose names she didn't know had signed legal documents attesting to her incapacity. She had never met them. She had never been examined. She was, in every practical sense, fully functional. And somewhere in this city, 2 people with medical licenses had signed their names to the opposite claim. She photographed the signatures with her phone and sent the image to Diane Cho at 11:47 p.m. with a message that said, I need everything you can find on these 2 men by morning. It's urgent. I'll explain when I see you. Diane responded in 4 minutes on it. You safe? Elena looked at the warehouse walls, the men at the doors, the files on the table, the cold coffee. For now, she typed back. The operation at Graham's father's house did not go as planned. Graham's code worked. That part was fine. What wasn't fine was the study, which had been partially cleared, not ransacked, but selectively emptied, in the deliberate way of someone who had anticipated that it might be accessed. The physical files Graham had described were present but thinned. Whatever had been most sensitive had been moved in the past 12 hours. Adrian's man Harmon called it in from outside the house at 1:17 a.m. Alina was in the van 2 blocks away with Adrian beside her, listening on the phone. How much is missing? Adrian said. Hard to say. Maybe 40% of what we expected, based on Graham's description. The medical documentation is gone. The correspondence files are gone. A pause. There's something else. What? There's a photograph on the desk. Recent, it's not framed, just left there, like it was placed. Of what? Of the warehouse. The Riverside location. Another pause. Exterior shot. Daytime. It's recent, the weather's right, for yesterday or today. Elena and Adrian looked at each other in the dim interior of the van. He knew we were coming, Elena said. Not to Adrian. To herself. To the particular cold space in her chest that had been accumulating information for 2 days, and was now presenting its conclusions with the finality of arithmetic. Her father had known. Possibly since Graham arrived at the estate. Possibly earlier. The photograph on the desk was not evidence, it was a message. He'd left it there for her. He wanted her to know he was ahead of her. Pull Harmon out, Elena said. Adrian relayed the instruction. Then he put the phone down and looked at the windshield and said nothing for a moment. The meeting tomorrow night, Elena said. It may be a trap. It was probably always a trap. She pressed the back of her head against the van's interior wall. Question is whether we can make that work for us. He looked at her. He expects me to come, she said. Photograph was an invitation. He's been moving me toward that warehouse since yesterday morning. She turned to meet his eyes. The question isn't whether we walk into it. The question is what condition we're in when we do. They drove back through the city in silence. streets, nearly empty now, the storefronts, dark, the traffic signals, cycling through their colors, for nobody. She slept for 3 hours. She didn't plan to. She sat on the edge of the bed in the secondary location's second-floor room, with the copied document in her hands, intending to think, and the thinking dissolved into black at some point between one sentence and the next. She woke at 5 a.m. with the document still in her lap, and a clarity that felt almost violent after the fog of the previous days. She knew what she needed to do. She spent the next hour writing it out, not plans. Exactly. More like the anatomy of what the evening would require. What she would say. What she needed Graham to say. What had to happen before the warehouse. During it, and in the window immediately after, when everything would be moving too fast for decisions and would have to already be made. At 6 a.m. she went and found Adrian. He was in the main room below, at a table with 3 of his people, looking at something on a laptop. He'd slept somewhere between 0 and 2 hours, by the look of him. He had a cut on his jaw that hadn't been there the previous evening. She didn't ask about it. "I need to talk to you alone," she said. His people left without being asked. She sat across from him and put her written pages on the table between them. "I'm going in first, before your people, before any show of force." He looked at the pages, then at her. "No. Hear me out. I've heard you. The answer is no. The trust cannot be transferred by force," she said. "It requires my voluntary signature. My father knows this. Your people arriving in force gives him a hostage situation, and in a hostage situation, the voluntary signature becomes extremely negotiable." She held his gaze. "But if I walk in alone, I'm what he wants. I'm the thing he's been moving toward for 11 years. He won't shoot the thing he's been trying to acquire. He put a hit on you 2 days ago. That was a contingency, a backup plan. The primary plan is still the trust." She put her finger on the first page. "I go in. I give him the impression he's winning. I keep him talking long enough for federal investigators to arrive." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You said federal investigators." "I've been in contact with Diane Cho since last night. She has a contact at the Financial Crimes Division. The evidence in those files, the wire transfers, the physician fraud, the trust manipulation, it's enough. But they need time to position, and they need my father physically present and on record." Adrian looked at her steadily. "This was your plan from this morning?" "Yes." "When were you going to tell me now?" He stood up, turned away, put both hands on the far edge of the table, and stood with his back to her for a moment, in the particular way of someone containing something. "You should have told me last night," he said. "Last night I wasn't sure it would work," she said. "This morning I am." He turned back. "The window between you walking in and federal positioning, how long?" 15 minutes. Maybe 20. That's a long time alone in a room with Thomas Winslow. I know. He is not Elena. He is not a man who behaves predictably when he's cornered. I know that too." She pulled the pages back. "Which is why Graham is coming in with me. 2 people is harder to manage than 1. And Graham's presence tells my father that his ozone network is fracturing. That creates a different kind of pressure." Adrian looked at her for a long time. "What do you need from me?" he said finally. "Cover the exits. All of them. And the moment those federal vehicles move, your people move simultaneously." She met his eyes. "Not before. If your people spook him before the investigators are in position, the evidence chain breaks, and he walks." He absorbed that. She could see him running the variables the way he ran everything fast, methodical, without apparent emotion that wasn't being chosen. "If something goes wrong inside," he said, "if he moves on you before the 15 minutes, then you come in," she said. "Use your judgment. My judgment would be to come in immediately." "I know, which is why I'm asking you to override it." Another silence. "All right," he said. She nodded. "Elena," he said. Looked up from the pages. "If he touches you," he said, and his voice had changed register, dropped to something quieter and more direct than anything she'd heard from him. "Yet the federal timeline stops mattering to me." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "Try to let it matter anyway." The van left the warehouse at 7:45 p.m. The city was doing its early evening thing, the day shift going home, the night coming in, the particular dense energy of a city in transition between its versions of itself. Elena sat in the back and watched it through the tinted window and felt the calm that had been building in her since morning settle into something final and functional. Graham was beside her. He hadn't spoken much since she'd outlined what he was required to do. He'd gone pale in the specific way of someone who understood the stakes and was working very hard, not to show how frightened they were. He wasn't doing a great job of it. You don't have to say much, she told him. When we're inside, you're there for presence. Let me do the talking, and if he asks me directly, tell the truth about why you came to us. You were afraid. You saw what the family was doing, and you couldn't say what you said to me yesterday. It was true. Use it. He looked at his hands. He's going to know I told you about the meeting. Yes, that's Elena. That's not nothing. I know what he'll do, she said. That's why you stay between me and the door, and you don't make any sudden movements, and you follow every instruction I give you exactly. She turned to look at him. Can you do that? He looked at her, at the woman he'd spent 3 years deceiving, sitting in a van on the way to face the man who'd engineered that deception, and she could see him trying to locate something in himself that was up to what she was asking. Yes, he said. The Riverside warehouse was visible from 3 blocks out. It was large, industrial, the kind of structure that had been built for function rather than concealment, a legitimate business address on a legitimate street, receiving deliveries during legitimate hours, doing other things at other times. The river ran behind it, black and moving. The parking area in front was sparse 4 vehicles that hadn't been there in the daylight photographs. Adrian's voice came through the earpiece. Elena had agreed to wear. We're in position. North exit, south exit, river access, all covered. Federal team is 4 minutes out. Good, she said. You have the recorder. She touched her jacket pocket. A small device, no larger than a pen, already running. Yes, if you need to abort, I'll say the word. What word? She thought for exactly 1 second. Suitcase, she said. Pause. All right. The van stopped. She and Graham got out. The warehouse entrance was a standard industrial door steel. Heavy, no visible lock from the outside. As they approached, it opened from within. The man who opened it was large, expressionless, and had the particular quality of someone whose job was to be in the way. He looked at Graham, then at Elena, then stepped aside. Inside, the warehouse was cold. The kind of cold that accumulates in large unheated spaces regardless of the season, bone deep. The cold of concrete and metal and still air. The floor was bare. Shelving units lined the far wall, stacked with the actual refrigeration equipment that served as the business's legitimate face. Fluorescent lights ran the length of the ceiling. In the center of the floor, a table. 2 chairs on the far side. 1 chair on the near side. At the far side of the table, 2 men. One she didn't recognize, older, suited, the type of face that appeared in legal documents rather than conversations. The other was her father. Thomas Winslow was 63 years old and had spent 11 years building himself into something she didn't recognize from the photograph she'd studied in the file. Beard was there, the heaviness. But in person there was something else, quality stillness that she recognized. With a jolt she didn't allow herself to show, as something she'd seen in herself. The stillness of someone who'd learned very young that showing your thoughts was a form of vulnerability. She'd learned it growing up with him. He stood when she walked in. Elena, he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered. That was the worst part. 22 years and his voice was exactly the same. Sit down, she said. He looked at her, at Graham, at her again. Something moved in his face, calculation, primarily, but underneath it, visible to her, because she'd studied that face in files and in memory for 2 days, something else. Something that might have been, in a person with a different history, something like feeling. He sat. She sat across from him. Graham positioned himself to her left, between her and the door, exactly as she'd told him. You look like your mother, her father said. Don't, she said. The word came out flat and hard, and she didn't take it back. He accepted that, folded his hands on the table. You've been busy, he said. Yes. Adrian Vale's files. He said the name without weight, not dismissive, just named. How much of it did you read? All of it. Then you know more about the last 11 years than most people I've employed. He almost smiled, not warmly, with a kind of professional appreciation that made her stomach turn. I always thought you'd be better at this than your mother. She's alive, Elena said. Not a question. Something in his face changed just slightly, just for a second. What makes you Adrian's file on her was incomplete. she said. Not because he didn't have information, because someone had accessed it and removed pages. Someone who knew what to look for. She held his gaze. You've been managing that file, which means you've been managing her. The warehouse was very cold and very quiet, and Elena felt her heartbeat in her throat, but kept her voice level and her hands still on the table. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Your mother made choices, he said carefully. She's fine. Where? That's a conversation for after we've concluded our business. Our business, she said. He reached inside his jacket slowly, deliberately, both hands visible, and produced a single folded document. He placed it on the table between them. The trust transfer. You sign this, and you walk away from everything else. Whatever Vale has told you, whatever his investigation has turned up, it becomes irrelevant. You take a settlement, a real one, significant, and you live your life. She looked at the document. She didn't touch it. And the power of attorney, she said. The one with the 2 physician signatures. He was still. Where did you? Carr's office, she said. We photographed it 2 nights ago. She watched his face recalibrate. I know what it says. I know what it would have meant. I know what a 3rd signature and a judicial stamp would have done. She paused. I want to know if you were going to kill me or just bury me. The man beside him, the suited one, made a movement. Her father raised one hand slightly, and the man stopped. Extreme measures, her father said, become necessary when people refuse to cooperate. I would have cooperated, she said. And for the first time, something came into her voice that wasn't controlled, something raw and unprocessed that has been sitting under the last 3 years and the last 48 hours. I didn't know the trust existed. I didn't know you were alive. If you had come to me and told me, you would have gone to the authorities. You don't know that. I know you, he said. You've always had your mother's principles. He says it, the way some people say the word impractical. I couldn't risk it. She looked at him. At the man who had built an empire on the ruins of a family he'd faked his death to escape. At the man who had arranged her marriage as a financial instrument. At the man who had, in a dining room somewhere in this city, discussed her death as a contractor, quote. Trust is mine, she said. It was always mine. You put my name on it because you needed a legitimate heir and you couldn't use your own. You built it for yourself, and you put my name on it, and then you spent 11 years trying to take it back. She put both hands flat on the table. I'm not signing that document. Her father's face went very still. Elena, but I'll tell you what I will do, she said. I'll give you 60 seconds to tell me where my mother is. His jaw moved. Because in approximately 90 seconds, she said, this building is going to get very crowded, and after that, the window for any kind of voluntary cooperation closes permanently. Stared at her. Then, for the first time, he looked at the space around them at the warehouse, the exits, the silence outside. That was not quite the right kind of silence, and she watched him understand. He looked back at her. You came here wired, he said. Yes. The federal. Yes. Something crossed his face, not fear exactly, but its functional equivalent in a man who'd spent 11 years being too careful for ordinary fear, the recognition of an ending. He looked at Graham. Graham held his gaze and didn't look away. Then her father's hand moved, not toward her, toward the suited man beside him. Now, her father said. The suited man stood. His jacket came open. Elena was already moving backward, out of the chair when the warehouse doors blew in, not explosively. With force, with speed, with the compressed urgency of 8 federal agents in tactical gear moving through 2 entry points simultaneously, and Adrian's people hitting the rear exits at the same second. Coordinated convergence that filled the warehouse with controlled noise and light and the specific, overwhelming authority of a plan that had been calibrated for exactly this room. The suited man stopped moving. Everyone stopped moving. In the sudden, flat silence that followed the initial breach, Elena was standing 6 feet from her father's side of the table, breathing hard, her heart doing something she'd deal with later, looking at Thomas Winslow across the distance. He was still seated. His hands were on the table. His face had done something she had never, in any memory or any photograph, seen it do before. It had gone defeated, not broken, not destroyed. Just the particular terrible blankness of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. Federal agents moved to either side of him. Legal instructions were stated in the clipped, procedural tones of people for whom this was a professional act, rather than a personal one. Her father looked at her as they reached him. "Where is she?" Elena said. Her voice was very quiet. "One more time." He looked at her with that blankness for a moment longer. Then he said a city name and a street address in a voice that was completely flat, completely stripped of strategy, and Elena committed it to memory with the specific, focused attention of someone who has been waiting 22 years for a piece of information and intends to use it the moment they get clear of this room. Then Graham made his mistake.
It happened fast.
The way things happen when fear and bad judgment collide in a person who has been holding both for too long. From the corner of her vision, she registered movement. Not Graham running. Not Graham fighting. Graham reaching into his jacket with instinctive panic motion of someone trying to produce identification or a phone or something that would establish his cooperation with the right side of the room. One of the federal agents reacted the way agents are trained to react when someone makes a rapid movement toward their jacket in an active situation. Athena saw the agent move and she moved faster. She stepped between Graham and the agent with both hands raised, her voice cutting across the noise. "He's with me. He's with me. He's a witness. He came voluntarily." The agent stopped. Graham's hand came out of his jacket holding a phone. Nobody moved for 2 full seconds. Elena lowered her hands, turned and looked at Graham. He was white-faced, shaking slightly, staring at the agent with the expression of a man who has just understood how close certain things can come. "Put the phone in your pocket," she said quietly, "and don't move again unless I tell you to." He put the phone in his pocket. She turned back to the room. Her father was on his feet now, hands being positioned by agents, the procedural machinery of a Shinivras moving around him with the indifferent efficiency of a system that does not pause for family dynamics. He looked at her once more over his shoulder as they moved him toward the east entrance. She looked back. She did not have a name for the thing she felt in that moment. She wasn't sure there was a name for it, the specific compound of recognition and grief and anger, and the strange, disorienting relief of something that has been unresolved for 22 years, finally resolving, even badly, even like this. She held his gaze until he was through the door. Then Adrian was beside her. She didn't hear him approach. She registered his presence, the way you register the end of something not dramatically, just as a fact. "Are you all right?" he said. She considered the question seriously. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was evening out. Somewhere in her chest, something was doing something she'd have to sit with later. "He told me where she is," she said. Adrian was quiet. "My mother," she said. He gave me an address. "We can—" "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I need to—" She stopped, started again. "I need 10 minutes where nothing is happening." He said nothing. He simply stood beside her in the cold warehouse, while the federal operation moved around them, agents and equipment and the procedural language of an arrest, the whole complicated machinery of consequence coming down on 11 years of careful architecture. She stood in the middle of it and breathed. And somewhere across the city, in the file on Adrian's table that she hadn't yet finished reading, the last pages waited with the particular patience of things that have been true for a long time and are simply waiting to be seen. The night was not over, but the thing she'd walked into the warehouse, carrying the shape of a woman who didn't know her own story that was gone. What replaced it was still forming, and it was going to need the morning to find its edges. The 10 minutes she'd asked for turned into 20. Nobody came to rush her. Adrian had apparently communicated something to the federal team about giving her space, because the agents moved around the perimeter of the warehouse and processed the scene, and nobody approached the spot where she stood near the center table, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes on the middle distance. The suited man, her father's representative, was being walked out the north exit. She watched him go without particular feeling. He was administrative, function. Whatever he'd signed his name to, whatever he'd facilitated, the accounting of it would be handled by people with briefcases and subpoenas, and she didn't need to carry it. Graham sat on a crate near the east wall. One of Adrian's people had brought him water, which he was holding in both hands without drinking. He looked like someone who had run a very long race he hadn't trained for and was only now understanding what the finish line actually cost. She walked over to him. He looked up. "You're going to need an attorney," she said. "Not your family's attorney. Your own. Someone who has no prior relationship with your father or anyone connected to him. I know. Diane Cho can refer you to someone. She won't represent you conflict of interest, but she'll give you a name." He looked at the water bottle. "I didn't know about the physicians," he said. "The signatures. I want you to know I didn't know that part." She looked at him for a moment. She believed him. She wasn't sure that made it matter enough to say so, but she believed him. "You knew enough," she said. "Deal with what you knew." He nodded. One small, exhausted nod. She left him there and went to find Adrian. He was outside the south exit, on the phone, standing near the river's edge, where the light from the warehouse didn't quite reach. The river behind him was dark and moving, and the city lights on the far bank made their broken reflections in the water. She waited until he finished the call. "The address," she said. "My mother. Can you verify it tonight?" He looked at his phone. "I have someone in that city. I can have eyes on the address within 2 hours. I need to know she's physically there, that she's safe, that she stopped. I don't know what condition she's in. My father said she made choices. I don't know what that means. It might mean she chose to stay." Elena had been turning that over for 3 hours. Since the moment her father had said it, "Your mother made choices. Fine." The specific, careful way he'd said fine, which was not the same as saying well or free or happy. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm afraid of." Adrian looked at her. He didn't offer reassurance. She was grateful for that. 2 hours, he said. "I'll have something for you." She went back inside and picked up the copied files from where she'd set them on the table before the doors had blown in. She squared them, put them back in the case, and carried them to the van. She sat in the van alone for a while. She thought about the courthouse, about the morning 3 days ago that felt like a month, about the suitcase she'd carried down the steps and the convoy of black cars and Adrian's voice saying, "You're not going anywhere alone," about the way Graham had looked at the cameras instead of at her when he slid the papers across the table. She thought about her father's face when the agents reached him, the defeated blankness, the city name and street address delivered in that stripped, strategic voice. She didn't know if he'd given it to her as a genuine concession or as one final piece of management. She didn't know if she'd ever know. She thought about her mother. Then she stopped thinking and just sat in the quiet of the van with the case on her lap until Adrian knocked on the window. She opened the door. "We need to debrief with the federal team," he said. "Shouldn't take more than an hour and then we go." The debrief took 90 minutes. She sat across from a federal investigator named Race, a woman in her 40s with efficient handwriting and the particular, flatly professional warmth of someone who had conducted these conversations many times, and she answered every question completely and in order, and signed everything she was asked to sign. At one point, Reyes looked up from her notes and said, "The recorder you wore tonight, the audio is exceptionally clean. The address your father provided for your mother's location was captured clearly." "Good," Elena said. "We'll be reaching out to authorities in that jurisdiction. Given the circumstances, if your mother has been residing there under any kind of duress or coercion." "She may not have been," Elena said. "She may have chosen it." Reyes held her pen. "That's possible," she said carefully. "Either way, we'll need to make contact and establish her current status." Elena looked at the table. "Can I go first?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. "We can coordinate that," she said. "It'll take a few days to arrange. But yes, I think that's the right approach." She signed the last form and left the building at 12:40 a.m. Outside, the river air hit her cold, faintly industrial, carrying that particular damp that rivers give off at night. She stood on the pavement outside the warehouse and looked at the dark water for a moment and breathed it in. Adrian appeared beside her. They stood there for a minute without speaking. "She's there," he said finally. "My contact confirmed. A house on the address he gave. She's been there at least 3 years. The neighbors know her as a woman named Margaret, who keeps a garden and doesn't have many visitors." Elena closed her eyes. Margaret, her mother's middle name. She hadn't known until this moment exactly what she'd expected to feel when she got confirmation. Something large, probably. Something that required more from her than she currently had available. But what she actually felt was something smaller and quieter, a long-held breath releasing, a tension she'd carried, so long she'd stopped distinguishing it from her own skeleton. "Is she all right?" Elena said. "She appears to be," Adrian said. "My contact said she was out in the garden this afternoon. She has a cat." Elena opened her eyes. The river moved. The city lights reflected in broken pieces. "A cat," she said. "Gray one, apparently." She didn't laugh, but something in her face shifted in a direction that wasn't grief. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They drove back through the city in the same van, the same convoy. The streets even emptier now, in the dead hours, between midnight and 3. Elena sat with a case on her lap and watched the city go by, and did not try to organize her thoughts into anything sequential. At one point, Adrian said, from across the seat, "The federal case will take months, probably longer. The financial reconstruction alone. I know. Your father has attorneys. Good ones, even now. Case is solid, but it won't be fast. I know that too." "Quiet. What happens to the trust?" she said. "While it's in litigation. It's frozen, pending the investigation. But your legal ownership isn't in dispute. The original instrument is clear. Diane Cho can file for administrative control within the week. You'd be able to access operating funds without full resolution of the criminal case." She looked out the window. A woman walking a dog at 1 a.m., the dog investigating something on a lamppost with tremendous focus. Ordinary life, doing what ordinary life does. "I want to use it," she said. "State, the legitimate holdings, whatever can be cleanly separated from the criminal proceeds and verified." She turned to look at Adrian. "I want to rebuild it as something real." He watched her. "There are people who get maneuvered into arrangements like mine," she said. "Marriages, financial traps, situations designed to leave them legally isolated and without recourse. I know what it feels like to have every exit managed before you get there." She turned back to the window. "I want the foundation to do something about that." He was quiet for a moment. "That'll take time to structure. I have time, and money eventually. And Diane," she said, "and whatever forensic accountant she recommends. And probably 2 years of paperwork that will make the last 3 days look restful." "Probably," he said. She looked at him. "What happens to your organization?" He held her gaze. "I've been thinking about that for longer than you'd expect," he said. "Parts that run on, fear the leverage, the implied threat, the parts where people cooperate because they don't feel they have another option." He paused. "I'm done with that. And the parts that aren't. Security, logistics. The infrastructure that's actually legitimate. There's more of it than the reputation suggests." He looked at his hands. "It'll take time to separate cleanly. Some people will leave. Some things will have to be wound down. It's going to cost you." "Yes." Is that something you've decided, or something you're telling me because it fits the moment?" He looked at her directly. "Both," he said. "And I'd rather tell you both than perform one." She nodded. The van stopped in front of the secondary warehouse. People got out. Equipment was unloaded. The machinery of a night operation coming down. She didn't go inside immediately. She stood on the street in the pre-dawn cold and looked at the building and thought about the next steps in the order they would need to happen. And the order was very long, and none of it was going to be easy, and she felt underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the cold air and the river smell still in her jacket, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Ready, she went inside. The next 3 days were the most procedurally intense of her life, which was saying something given the previous week. Diane Cho arrived at 8 a.m. the morning after the warehouse with 2 associates and a briefcase and a coffee she'd bought herself because she hadn't been invited and hadn't waited to be. She sat across from Elena in the warehouse's second-floor room and listened to the full account without interrupting. And when Elena finished, Diane opened her briefcase and began. They worked for 11 hours. By the end of the first day, the filing for administrative trust control was drafted. By the end of the second, the physician fraud documentation had been forwarded to the state medical board with Diane's cover letter. By the end of the third, Carr, the attorney who had held the power of attorney, had been contacted by federal investigators and had, according to Reyes, cooperated with notable speed. Graham retained an attorney on Diane's referral. He came to see Elena on the second day, briefly, in the corridor outside the room where she and Diane were working. He stood in the doorway and didn't come in. I gave a full statement, he said. Everything. My father's involvement, the payments, the recordings, all of it. She looked at him from across the room. My father's attorney is saying he may be able to negotiate something, Graham said, given the cooperation. That's between him and the prosecutors, she said. He stood there for a moment longer. He looked like someone who had something he wanted to say and couldn't find the version of it that was honest without being either self-serving or pointlessly punishing. I'm sorry, Elena, he said. I know that it doesn't fix it, she said, but it's true. So thank you for saying it without the qualifications. He nodded once. Go work with your attorney, she said. Build something honest out of whatever they let you keep. That's the only thing that matters now. He left. She watched the doorway for a moment after he was gone. Diane, across the table, didn't comment. She just turned a page and kept working. On the fourth day, Elena went to find her mother. She drove herself. She'd borrowed a plain car from Adrian's fleet, not one of the black Convoy vehicles, just a gray sedan, unremarkable, kind of car that disappeared in traffic. And she drove the 200 miles alone with the radio off and the window cracked just enough for moving air. The city her father had named was smaller than she'd expected, a mid-sized river town, the kind of place that had reinvented itself several times over the past decades and was currently in the process of becoming something quiet and slightly artistic, with coffee shops in old storefronts and galleries in former industrial spaces. She found the street without difficulty. The house was a narrow 2-story on a residential block, well-maintained, the paint relatively fresh, a garden in the front that had been put to bed for the approaching winter with the methodical care of someone who took the off-season seriously. Window boxes, a stone path, and sitting on the front step in a coat that was slightly too thin for the weather, watching the street with the alert composure of someone who had been expecting a visitor, a woman with gray-streaked hair and her mother's hands and Elena's own eyes. Elena parked the car. She sat in it for a moment. Then she got out. Her mother stood when she reached the garden gate. She was 61 years old, and she looked it not diminished by it, just marked. The face Elena remembered from the photograph she'd kept for 22 years, a photograph taken when her mother was 39, had become something more settled, more complicated. The face of someone who had lived a significant amount of life since that photograph and had not been easy on herself about any of it. Elena, her mother said. Her voice was the same. 22 years and her voice was exactly the same. Elena opened the gate and walked up the stone path and stopped 2 feet away. She had prepared for this. She had thought about it in the car and in the hotel room the night before, and in the 3 days of procedural work that had kept her from thinking about anything except immediate problems. She had imagined it as something that would require careful management of her emotions. The conversation, the years between them, the particular shape of a reunion that contained abandonment inside it. What she hadn't prepared for was her mother reaching forward and putting both hands on either side of her face, the way you hold something you've been afraid of losing, and saying, very quietly and very directly, "I know what you've been through. I know some of it. I'm so sorry I wasn't there." Elena's eyes went hot. She didn't cry. Not immediately. She stood on the stone path in the thin October sun and let her mother hold her face in her hands and breathed through the complicated mass of things she'd carried for 22 years. Then she said, "You left." "Yes. I thought you were dead." "I know. He told me you died. There was a funeral." "I know, Elena. I know." Her mother's hands stayed where they were. "I left because I found out what he was building, what he intended to use you for. I was going to take you and run." Her voice broke on the last word, just slightly, just enough. "He found before I could. He gave me a choice: leave alone or stay and watch him do it anyway, with me trapped inside it." Elena looked at her. "I left," her mother said, "and I have hated myself for it every day since. Not because leaving was wrong, because I left without you." The garden was very quiet. A bird somewhere in the neighbor's tree. The sound of a car 3 blocks away. "Why didn't you find me?" Elena said. "After. When I was grown. When I could have—" "He told me if I contacted you, he'd activate the trust process immediately. Before you had any chance to understand what was happening." Her hands dropped from Elena's face. She looked at them. "Every year I stayed away was a year I told myself you were safe, unknown to him, building a life he hadn't calculated into the plan yet." She looked up. "Then you married Graham Mercer, and I knew the plan had already been running. I just didn't know how to reach you without making it worse. You could have found a way." "Yes," her mother said simply. "Could have. I chose the wrong kind of protection." She held Elena's gaze. "That's not something I can undo." Elena stood with that, with the honesty of it, which was harder to receive than a defense would have been. A good defense she could have argued against. This she could only hold. "I have a cat," her mother said after a moment. Elena blinked. "I know that sounds unjust." Her mother almost smiled. "I thought you should know there are some good things here. It's not just—" She gestured vaguely at the years. "His name is Harold. He's an idiot, but he keeps me company." Elena looked at the house. In the front window, a gray shape was positioned on the sill, watching the street with the sovereign indifference of a well-settled cat. She exhaled. Something in her chest, the place where the long-held breath had lived, that she'd thought had released at the riverside the night before, released something else. Something deeper. Something that had been clenched since she was 7 years old, and someone had taken her to a grave and told her it was her mother's. "I'm going to need you to come back," Elena said. Her mother looked at her. "Not immediately. And not because I need you to. Because I want you to." She looked at her mother's face, the complicated, marked, 22-year face of a woman who had made a terrible choice for a reason that Elena was going to spend a long time with before she decided what she thought of it. "Spent the last 4 days rebuilding things. I'm going to spend the next 2 years doing more of it. And I think—" She paused. "I think I'd like someone who knew the original architecture." Her mother's eyes went bright. "Harold travels," her mother said. "I'll make room," Elena said. They went inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee soil from the garden, and faintly like a cat who'd recently been in from outside. And they sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours and talked not about the trust or the case or the legal machinery that was now grinding through its process, but about the years. Specific, ordinary, irretrievable years. What Elena had done with them. What her mother had done with them. Because the things that had been good in the middle of everything. Because there had been good things in the middle of everything. And pretending otherwise would be another kind of loss. Harold the cat came and sat on Elena's feet under the table and did not move for 2 hours, which her mother said was unusual, which Elena took as something without naming what. She drove back the same day. She drove back the same day. She didn't stay the night, not because she didn't want to, but because she was needed and she knew she was needed. And she was beginning to understand that knowing when to return to a thing was different from leaving it. She and her mother would figure the rest out. 5 weeks later, the trust administrative control was granted. 6 weeks after that, Diane filed the articles of incorporation for the foundation. Elena signed them at a desk in Diane's office on a Tuesday morning, while rain moved through the city in the gray, deliberate way of November rain that intends to stay. She named the foundation after nothing sentimental. She named it after a function, the Voss Winslow Access Foundation, which would provide legal advocacy, financial counseling, and support infrastructure for individuals trapped in coercive financial arrangements or forced into legal isolation by family or intimate partners. The name was both her mother's family and her father's, which she'd thought about for a long time before deciding. Not as reconciliation, as acknowledgement. This was where the money came from. This was what it would be used for now. The history of it was the reason for it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Diane signed as a witness and capped her pen and said, "He's going to fight the asset classification. I know his attorneys are good. Yours are better," Elena said. Diane almost smiled. That's true. Adrian came by the foundation's temporary offices, a leased space, in a building 3 blocks from Diane's firm on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks after the warehouse. Came alone, without the convoy, driving himself in a car she didn't recognize. He knocked on the open door of the room she'd been using as her primary workspace stacks of files, 2 laptops, 3 coffee cups in various states, a whiteboard covered in organizational structure that she'd been refining for a week. She looked up. He looked at the whiteboard, at the files, the 3 coffee cups. "You've been busy," he said. "Some of us don't have a staff of 12, she said. "You could. I'm working on it." She leaned back in her chair. "How's the restructuring?" "Painful," he said. "Expensive." "Correct. 3 good adjectives." He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, a folding chair slightly unsteady, the kind of furniture you acquire when you're leasing space temporarily and haven't committed to the good stuff yet. He sat in it without complaint. "Rourke pled out," he said. "The man who leaked the estate location. 12 years. She nodded. She'd heard from Reyes. "And my father," she said. "Case. Moving." Slowly, his attorneys filed 3 motions last week. Reyes says the financial reconstruction is airtight, but the timeline to trial is long, he agreed. She looked at him across the desk. He looked tired in the way he'd looked tired since the beginning, the kind of accumulated, institutional tiredness that didn't lift quickly. But there was something else there now. Something that looked in the particular Thursday afternoon light like someone who had set something down that they'd been carrying too long. "The legitimate operations," she said. "Your logistics and security work. I'd like to talk to you about a potential contract." He raised an eyebrow. "The foundation is going to need field capacity," she said. "People who can verify conditions on the ground when we're assessing cases. Secure transport in certain situations. Contacts in jurisdictions where we'll need to move quickly." She kept her voice professional and watched his face. "I'm not interested in the parts of your organization that run on fear. I'm interested in the parts that don't." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a very careful way to propose a business relationship." "I thought it was appropriately careful." "It was." He paused. "I'll have my people draw up a preliminary proposal." "Good." He stood to leave. Then he stopped. "Elena." She looked up. He stood in the doorway of her folding chair office with its whiteboards and its stacked files and its 3 coffee cups, and he looked at her with the particular expression she'd cataloged over the past 6 weeks. Not careful, not controlled, not the face he showed the room. The other one. The one that appeared when he'd run out of the energy required to maintain the distance. "The courthouse," he said. That morning, when I said what I said in front of the cameras, I remember. I need you to know that what I said. I know, she said. He was quiet. I know it wasn't only strategy, she said. You don't have to explain it. He held her gaze for a moment. Okay, he said. He left. She turned back to the whiteboard. The organizational structure looked back at her boxes and lines and names and functions, the anatomy of something being built from the beginning without inherited architecture, without someone else's plan embedded in its foundation. She picked up her marker and added a line she'd been thinking about. For a week, a connection between the legal advocacy arm and the field operations function, and stood back and looked at it. It was imperfect. The structure had gaps. There were things she hadn't solved yet and things she wouldn't solve until she'd tried them and found out they didn't work. There were going to be hard days and bad decisions and mornings when the whole thing felt impossible and evenings when someone she'd tried to help didn't get helped in time. She knew all of that. She was going to do it anyway. Months later, on a morning in early spring when the city was doing its tentative, reluctant version of warming up, not convinced, not committed, but moving in the direction, Elena drove to the courthouse. She hadn't planned to. She was on her way to a meeting across town, and she was taking a different route, and the courthouse appeared at the end of the block, the way things appear when you've been circling around them. Parked. She sat in the car and looked at the steps where she'd stood 6 months ago with a worn leather suitcase, and she looked at the spot at the base of the steps where Adrian had stood, and she looked at the street where the convoy of black cars had arranged themselves in their perfect still formation. She sat there for a few minutes. Then she got out of the car. She walked to the base of the steps and stood where he had stood and looked up at the courthouse doors. They were just doors. They opened and closed on ordinary things. Contracts, disputes, the administrative machinery of lives intersecting with the law. 6 months ago, they had opened on the end of one version of her life. She heard a car behind her. She turned. The gray sedan Adrian had been driving lately, not the convoy, not the fleet. Just a car was parked at the curb. He was leaning against the driver's side door with his jacket open and his hands in his pockets. And he looked, in the early spring light, considerably less like the man who had stepped out of a center vehicle in a coordinated intimidation display, and considerably more like someone who was where he wanted to be. Found her here. She didn't ask how. I have a meeting, she said. I know. I'm going to the same meeting. He pushed off from the car. I drove past and saw your car. She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had been watching her life from the outside for 8 years, and had finally, at a courthouse on a cold morning with cameras running, stepped into it. She thought about what she'd carried up those steps 6 months ago, the suitcase, the settlement, the signed papers, the accumulated weight of a marriage that had been a mechanism. She thought about what she was carrying now, the files, the case, the foundation, her mother's phone number saved in her contacts, Harold the cat's completely unfounded territorial claim on one corner of Elena's new office, 2 years of work ahead of her that she wanted to do. She thought about how different it felt to walk toward something you'd chosen. We'll be late, she said. Probably, he agreed. She walked toward the car, and he fell into step beside her, not behind her, not ahead, just beside, and the courthouse doors were at her back, and the city was in front of her, imperfect and loud and full of things she hadn't solved yet. She got in, the door closed. They pulled away from the curb and moved out into the ordinary, irreplaceable morning, and the courthouse receded in the rearview mirror until it was just another building on just another street, holding its history quietly inside its walls, the way all buildings do, forward. The road ahead was long, and it was hers. She found the letter 3 months after the trial ended. It was in a box her mother had brought when she finally came back. Not the house. Not yet, but close enough. A rental apartment 4 blocks from Elena's office. chosen after 2 weeks of looking together on a Saturday afternoon that had felt, unexpectedly, like something recovered. The box had sat in Elena's storage room unopened because her mother had said it contained old papers, and old papers could wait. And Elena had agreed because she was learning, slowly, the difference between urgent and important. She opened it on a Sunday evening in late autumn, when the rain was back and the city was doing its gray interior thing. The letter was at the bottom. Her name on the envelope in handwriting. She recognized her father's. Postmark was 11 years old. She sat on the floor of the storage room with the box in her lap and held the envelope for a long time without opening it. Then she opened it. It was 2 pages, handwritten, which surprised her. She'd expected something typed, something formal, the language of documents and instruments. Instead, it was his actual handwriting, slightly cramped on the right side, the way she remembered from childhood. And the language was not the language of strategy. He wrote that he had not intended for things to go the way they went, that when he'd built the trust, he'd told himself it was for her a foundation, a protection, something no one could take. Somewhere in the years of building it, the protection had become the thing he was protecting, and he'd lost track of the difference. He wrote that he knew she would probably never read this, that he was leaving it in a box that would reach her only if certain things happened, and he hoped they wouldn't happen, which was another way of saying he hoped to find a better path and never did. He wrote near the bottom of the second page, "I am not a good man. I think I knew that earlier than I admitted it, but I believed I was building something good, and I believed that made it different. Doesn't. I understand that now, and I don't expect you to forgive it." He had not signed it with love. He'd signed it with his name, Thomas Winslow. Just the name, plain, without ornamentation. She sat with the letter for a while. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the box and put the box on the shelf. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't going to perform forgiveness for the benefit of her own narrative. But she put the letter on the shelf instead of throwing it away, and she thought that was probably as honest as she could be about where she stood. Trial had ended 6 weeks prior. Her father had been convicted on 11 counts: wire fraud, financial coercion, conspiracy, and several charges she hadn't known existed before Reyes had explained them. The sentencing was still ahead. His attorneys were negotiating. Graham's cooperation had reduced his exposure significantly. He had testified for 4 days, clear, complete, detailed. His father had not. The elder Mercer was contesting everything and would be contesting it for years, which was the particular kind of punishment that arrived not as a verdict, but as a process. Graham had sold the family property. She'd heard it from Diane, who'd heard it from someone in the real estate community. She didn't know where he'd gone. She hoped he was building something honest. She thought there was a reasonable chance he was trying. Her mother knocked on the storage room door. Elena looked up. Her mother stood in the doorway, in the particular way she had, slightly careful, slightly waiting, not pushing, that Elena was still learning to read after a lifetime of not having it available. "I made dinner," her mother said. Elena looked at the box on the shelf. "There's a letter in there," she said. "From him. Written 11 years ago." She paused. "I'll show you sometime." "Not tonight." Her mother looked at the box, then at Elena. "Okay," she said. "No pressure, no urgency. Just okay." Elena got up off the floor and followed her mother to the kitchen, where the rain moved against the windows, and Harold occupied the warmest chair without apology, and dinner was the ordinary, irreplaceable kind of thing that becomes, over time, the actual substance of a life. She called Adrian after dinner. He picked up on the second ring. "I found something today," she said. "A letter. From my father. I'll tell you about it when I see you." "Are you all right?" he said. Thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." A brief quiet on the line. The comfortable kind. "The Foundation's quarterly report landed today," he said. 17 cases in the first quarter. Reyes forwarded it to the Financial Crimes Division as a model. I saw it. You should be proud of that, I am, she said. I'm also aware it took 6 people and 3 software systems, and Diane working on a Sunday to get there. That's what proud looks like in practice, he said. Almost laughed. It came out as something warmer. Good night, Adrian, she said. Good night. She stood at the kitchen window after she hung up and watched the rain on the glass, the way it moved, the way the city lights caught it, the way the street below was ordinary and wet and going about its business. She thought about the courthouse steps, the suitcase, Convoy. The moment she'd stood at the top of those steps and understood that the floor had dropped out of a room she'd thought was solid. She thought about everything that had come after the files, the warehouse, her father's face, her mother's hands on either side of her face, the letter at the bottom of a box. Thought about what she was building, the foundation, the work, the 2 years ahead that she'd chosen with her eyes open and her hands ready. She thought about what it felt like to stand in your own life without someone else's architecture underneath it. Felt like exactly this. Rain on a window, dinner on a Sunday, a mother 4 blocks away, a man who answered on the second ring, work that mattered in the morning, imperfect, incomplete, entirely her own. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside, the city kept going the way cities do, indifferent and alive, holding its 10,000 stories inside its lit and moving dark. Hers was one of them now, and it was only just beginning.